Welcome back to Leading Blind. Today let's discuss actors. Nelson Eddy was born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1901, and he grew up to be, in the height of his time, the highest paid singer in the world. The first time I ever heard Nelson Eddy sing was in 1943's The Phantom of the Opera. The Phantom of the Opera, at least this particular movie version, is about a violinist in love with a young singer whose music seems to be stolen, and in a terrible rage, an accident occurs where he becomes disfigured by acid. So he continues to try and help the career of the woman he's in love with by terrorizing the opera house. The Phantom is played by Claude Rains. Now, this girl, Christine Dubois, who's played by a 19-year-old Susanna Foster, is also being pursued by two other suitors. One is a police inspector, played by Edgar Barrier, named Raoul Debert, and the other is a baritone on the stage with her, Nelson Eddy, and his name is Anatole Garand. This movie is not the best, but it has some of the best music for Nelson to sing, at least as far as I've personally heard him do. It helps that he is opposite such an amazing singer with a crystalline voice. And it was very inventive because at the time, a lot of the music used in the movie was out of copyright symphonies that were just translated into operas. They came up with opera plots and lyrics and stuff to put to the music. And I think that was really neat, and it gave the entire movie a very unique tone. Nelson Eddy is the eager suitor, of course, for Christine. He thinks they make a great match. They're both singers. It makes sense in a lot of ways. And his rival is, he's a police officer. He's very logic-based. But they're both good guys. They just seem to be alpha mailing it a little bit. And in the end, they end up as friends because it does look like Christine's not about to make a decision. She's enjoying her career way too much to make a decision, and she kind of likes these two guys fighting over her a little bit. Also, just as a little interesting characteristic, there is a copper bust that Anatole makes of Christine Dubois in the movie, and that bust was actually sculpted by Nelson Eddy himself. And I think that's just the coolest, that he had this much talent, this much passion. And I highly suggest watching Phantom of the Opera. Not only is it a classic movie, but it's a great introduction to Nelson Eddy music. 1937's Maytime starred Nelson Eddy as Paul Allison, Jeanette MacDonald as Marcia Monet, and co-starred John Barrymore as Nikolai Nazarov. This is the movie I have seen the most times, and it is the one I love the most. According to what I've read, it's also Jeanette MacDonald's personal favorite out of the movies she did. So there's that. So I'm going to go into deeper detail with this one than Phantom of the Opera or Naughty Marietta. It starts on May Day with an old woman known as Ms. Morrison speaking to neighbors, young Barbara and Kip. Honestly, she mostly just speaks to Kip at first. He says there is a voice teacher in town, and he's interested in perhaps bringing Barbara to New York so she can be a great opera singer. Later at home, Ms. Morrison sees the two fighting over this, and Barbara runs to Ms. Morrison for comfort. She thinks that, you guys had a fight, you'll get over it, it'll be okay. And Barbara says, doesn't he understand? I just want to be a great singer, like this one or that one. And she names a couple people, but then she names Marcia Mornay, and Ms. Morrison says, I was Marcia Mornay. And it goes into this flashback sequence of Marcia Monet in France, a very popular young diva who's just up and coming in the opera world, arriving at the palace of Louis Napoleon for a command performance with her music teacher, Nikolai Nazaroff. She has an amazing performance. She is with Nikolai when he manages to manipulate a well-known composer named Trentini to agree to write an opera for her. And then later when they get home, she's all bubbly and wound up, and he proposes to her. She's taken aback by this, but she's willing to marry him. She thinks she'll be reasonably happy, and she's just glad he's not asking for other favors that don't require marriage, because he admits he has had that reputation, and he's seen that in her body language that she was worried about him doing that to her. So she agrees to marry him, but then, of course, I just performed for an emperor and I've been proposed to. I'm way too excited to sleep, so she decides to go for a carriage ride. Unfortunately for her, when she tells the driver to turn around, the horse breaks loose from the carriage and she's kind of left sitting there while he chases this horse. And in the cafe nearby, she hears singing. And the voice she hears is, of course, Nelson Eddy's voice. And he is singing this amazing, hilarious song about a fat prima donna. She goes into the cafe, sits down, he finishes his song, and then, notices her, and he starts flirting with her, and she gets recognized, and she runs out because she's told the carriage is all fixed. And he will not let go of her hand. He stands right up on the skids, I guess you would call it, of the carriage, or the footrest of the carriage, and he holds onto her hand. He's like, I'm not going to let go. She's like, you're going to hurt yourself. He's like, I'm not going to let go until you agree to have lunch with me. I'm not going to do it. So she agrees. She promises to meet him for lunch in the apartment he's pointed to. He celebrates with a hilarious song called Ham and Eggs. And I forget which tune it's based off of, but it's a fairly popular tune. You would probably recognize it if you heard it. Meanwhile, Marcia goes back to the hotel she's staying at, and Nazaroff is waiting for her. Apparently he came in for whatever reason, found her missing, and decided to wait for her to come back. She tries to explain to him, I wasn't off meeting anybody on purpose. I wasn't doing this. I just went for a carriage ride. And the horse got away. So, he relaxes. And the next day, Paul is in his apartment with his music teacher, or at least the guy who's trying to be his music teacher. Apparently Paul is not a very good or attentive student. And he's nervous that she won't arrive, but she does. There are a lot of shenanigans and antics which are funny, and were very funny for the time, I'm sure. They sing Carry Me Back to Old Virginia together, and after that, she's like, I need you to promise me to never talk to me again, never speak to me again, and she runs, she leaves. Later that day, Paul steals 2 tickets out of the pocket of a man who's sitting by the poster for the opera Marcia's in that night. And he ends up going to the performance, but they do end up being discovered by the guy who bought the tickets, and they get kicked out after a little while. But he goes backstage, he tries to talk to her, and again, kind of strong arms her into promising to meet him for the May Day festival the following day. And because she wants him to get the hell out before Nikolai comes back, she promises. Of course, when he goes to leave her dressing room, Nikolai's right there. And he basically is like, can the critics come in? Because those are the ones that fill up our seats. Silly little boys that come backstage, they just fill up the galleries. The next day, Marcia does meet Paul at the May Day Festival, and they have an amazing day together, going on the swings, which used to be a sweetheart thing, instead of just pushing your kids on it, dancing, singing, and then at the end of the day, he says, I'm going to sing you a song so that you'll always remember it, and he sings her the song Sweetheart, which is a gorgeous song. Unfortunately, and I don't know if this is the recording equipment they had at the time, but it's hard to understand Nelson when he's singing in English. I mean, at least I have an excuse when he sings in a foreign language, but when he sings in English, he sounds like his mouth is full of cotton balls. But it's still a beautiful song. The tone of his voice is amazing, and this is their love duet. But then after the song and the day that was meant to last them the rest of their lives, she goes off and she marries Nikolai, and we kind of transition through a bunch of, operatic successful scenes to several years later when Marcia is back in America and she's going to be performing in the opera Trentini wrote for her, and it turns out that Paul is the baritone in that theater, and he's the only one that can sing that role. They try to act like they just don't even really know each other, but unfortunately Paul's teacher from Fance is there, and he's like, no, I remember you, remember me? And, kind of blows it for them a little bit. But they use the night that Paul went to see her backstage as an excuse to, oh yeah, I kind of recognize you now. Like, oh yes, she gave me some great advice that night, and ever since then I began to work hard to be where I am today. Skip ahead to the opening night. They're performing, and their chemistry just goes bazonkers. It sets the stage on fire. They are amazing together, and it's pretty damn clear something special is going on that stage. While the audience is applauding during the finale, after the finale of the opera, Paul asks her to run away with him. He's like, you're not going back with him. Run away with me tonight. And she does agree, but later in her dressing room, she has her maid Ellen take a message to him to not do anything, foolish, to just wait until he hears from her. Nikolai comes in and he says, there's an awful lot you never thought to tell me. And she says that there's actually very, very little. But she admits that she doesn't want to be with him anymore. And he says he will divorce her, that he will give her her freedom. And a few minutes later, at the hotel, Marcia hears a door slamming. And she goes out to look for Nikolai, and she finds an empty gun case. So she knows where Paul lives. She sees his address next to the gun case or something like that. And rushes out after her husband. And there's a scene of Nikolai walking through the streets and her walking down the same streets, behind him in this very quiet, snowy night. So it seems very quiet. And they're actually moving kind of slow for people who are in such a rush. But Nikolai arrives at Paul's flat, and Paul lets him in. And Nikolai says, I'm giving Marcia her freedom. Then he says, and I'm giving you yours. And he pulls out the gun, and he shoots Paul. As he's leaving, Marcia arrives, and Paul tells her that day, May Day, it did last him the rest of his life. And he dies in her arms. So, of course, once that happens, we shift back to the old Marcia, telling Barbara why she can't let go what she has with Kip, She's not telling Barbara to give up on her dreams of being a singer. She's telling Barbara, don't give up on your romance with Kip because you will regret it. Don't make the mistake I did. After Paul died, I left Nikolai and I came here where nobody knows me except for my maid Ellen. And she left the opera scene completely. So her story is a complete and utter tragedy. However, after this whole scenario, we see Kip come down the road and he smiles and they talk and Barbara tells him, I'm not going to New York. So they're happy, they walk off together. And that leaves Marcia Mornay alone under a tree relaxing, and we see her die. And over her old body transposes an image of her young Marcia form, and she's in her beautiful May Day dress, and Paul Allison appears there. They're both kind of translucent at the time, and they're singing their song Sweethearts. And he takes her hand, and they walk through the gate and down the road together, and there's blossoms floating down from the trees everywhere. It's really pretty, really sappy, really uber romantic. It's kind of like if that very few seconds at the end of Titanic were stretched out over 6 minutes. That's kind of that's kind of what it's like here. This movie is dated. It's people will have problems with it if they're at all feminist or have a problem with sexism because different things were appropriate back then. the era that they are depicting in the movie was very different, even from the time when the movie was made. But, for instance, Paul Allison just won't let her be, and of course she has to be the polite little lady and make promises and keep them and stuff. But, it's part of the charm of these old movies. You might not agree with the way people thought back then, but you can accept that that's how it was. And I can go along with it in that regard. John Barrymore in this movie is amazing. Jeanette MacDonald, I used to love her voice. Now it's a little shrill for me, but it's not that bad. It's just a little shrill for my hearing nowadays. And Nelson Eddy breaks my heart. I mean, he's a little annoying now that I look back at the movie and a couple of his other movies, like Naughty Marietta, which I'll be talking about next. It's like, stop being so damn pushy. Stop not taking no for an answer. Go away, But I'm a woman from a different era. And there's just something about this movie that has so much charm. Now, I do want to tell you, this movie, just like Naughty Marietta, it's based off of an operetta that was on stage first. But from my understanding, they took songs from these operettas, probably just one of the songs, like Sweethearts, and they put it to a completely different plot. So I have no idea what the operetta itself is about. I'm going to have to look that up. For those of you who are interested, on YouTube, there is a radio production of this movie, of this show that they did in the 1950s. It's an hour long. Some of the music is different and in a different order, and they simplify things or express things more clearly because it's just a radio program. It's very obviously condensed because you lose about 30 minutes of the story. But if you just want an example of what it's about, you can watch that. It's still Nelson Eddy. It's still Jeanette MacDonald. But the John Barrymore role of Nikolai was replaced by Edgar Barrier, who was in, of course, Phantom of the Opera. So there's an interesting link for you. I can't recommend this movie enough. I don't know why I love it as much as I do. Maybe I just love my sappy tragic romances. But it's really worth at least watching once. Prior to Maytime, Jeanette and Nelson also starred in 1935's Naughty Marietta. If I'm not mistaken, this was the first film that these two appeared in together, and it was the first of 8 musical movies where they would be paired as sweethearts. In Naughty Marietta, Jeanette MacDonald plays Princess Marie de Namur de la Beaufort. Yes, I know it's a mouthful. Nelson Eddy plays Captain Richard Warrington, and the movie also co-stars, among others, Frank Morgan and Elsa Lancaster as the governor and his wife, Monsieur and Madame Denard. The story of Naughty Marietta follows the Princess Marie as she takes on the identity of her uncle's former maid in order to smuggle herself on a ship headed for the colonies of America to escape an arranged marriage with a Spanish older man. Of course, the ship is full of women who are going to New Orleans in America in order to get married to the colonists. So she just thinks she's going to just squeeze her way out of that one as well. The ship she is on is beset by pirates. They are taken ashore, and because of her own cunning, which I won't get into, she does manage to find help for them, and the pirates are overcome by the mercenaries headed by Nelson Eddy's character Warrington. He relentlessly pursues her until she starts to fall for him, and just when they're falling in love, she is outed as the princess by some French soldiers. Her uncle and fiancé arrive now that she's been found, and the governor and his wife throw a ball in her honor. She is told by a friend she made on the ship that Warrington fully intends on coming to this ball. And her uncle, who knows about these plans, says he's been ordered away, and if he shows up here, he will be arrested for treason and shot. So her and the governor are trying to keep him out of this ball, but he shows up anyways, and all his men come with him like a little army outside. He goes in and he gets her to the side, and she acts like she doesn't know him. Or she doesn't act like she doesn't know him. She acts like she was toying with his affections all the time, the whole time. And he's about to leave when she decides that she can't just watch him go. She can't do it. So she asks somebody who has been writing music for her since the beginning of the movie, that she's been trying to think of lyrics to the whole time and that he knows about. She decides to have him play this song for her, and she sings for those around her because they've heard this princess has a beautiful voice. So she sings the song to him. He ends up joining her in singing it. And when the song is over, he leaves out the front door and she goes upstairs. Turns out she escapes via her window or balcony or something. It doesn't go into too many specifics. And they march off with it together with his other mercenaries, singing the marching song that alerted them to his presence with the mercenaries back when the pirates were holding them captive. And that's it. Very simple, frivolous, silly little love thing. I've seen a few other Nelson Eddy movies, especially the ones that he starred in with Jim and Annette McDonald. And this is the silliest out of the three I chose to talk about, but the other ones I didn't really care for as much, at least in terms of story. There are some really good songs out there in the other movies. But these were the stories that stuck with me that I've watched more than once or twice. Nelson Eddy died in March of 1967, and a few days prior to his death, he actually told an interviewer that he intended to continue singing until he dropped. He never retired. For the most part, I believe he had moved strictly to the nightclub scene, which was something he loved doing because not only was he a very famous opera singer and known for his operatic voice, but he'd also made an impression with what they called the Bobby Soxers. I honestly haven't looked up the reference. I don't quite understand it. But he was kind of a cross-genre singer and would perform both types of music at his nightclub performances. And then he was on stage when all of a sudden he was having trouble singing one of his songs. And he asked the audience to have patience with him because the words simply weren't coming. He then asked the conductor to try a different song and was hoping, I assumed, that it would be easier to do that song. And while he was trying to perform this song, he ended up stopping and saying, "My face is going numb. Is there a doctor here?" And as far as I'm aware, those are the last reported words he ever spoke because he did collapse on the stage. He had suffered a stroke and he did pass away that night. I have to admire Nelson Eddy. He was born knowing what he wanted to do. He had an artistic entertainment family in his background. I believe one of his parents was a singer. I can't remember what his other parent did, but they were also in the arts in some way, shape, or form. And he continued following his passion until he was in his 60s. So you have to admire somebody that would have so much passion that they would just never stop. And he inspires me. He inspires me, and although the things he was in are now very dated, I still adore them. And honestly, if there's a heaven, I hope he's one of the people I get to meet someday when I go.